All right, shalom, shalom, shalom. Uh, Giving all praises, honor, and great esteem unto the Most High Power, Yahuwah, Bahashem, Yahushua, Hamashiach, and to the 12 tribes of Israel who are scattered to the four quarters of the earth. I say shalom wa baruchim, that is peace and blessings. And I cannot wait till the day that the Most High brings us back together, and we are once again 12 tribes, one family, one nation, under the Most High Power, under one covenant. Hallelujah.
Hallelujah.
You are live and direct with your Akazaki Yahoo, and I am joined by my most esteemed Kenanaya. Shalom, my king.
Hey, shalom, shalom, Maki. Shalom, shalom, Yasharal. Call halal Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahweh Shah HaMashiach, Barakatah.
Hallelujah. All praises to Yahweh in the name of Yahweh Shah, the Messiah. Bless you. Hallelujah. It is another Yom Shishi evening, and we are back with another video review. All praises to the Abba, and we're gonna get directly to it. We got a 3 in a row for you, a couple of short ones, and a rather interesting video about the Seminoles, brought to us by our good brothers over at. This first one comes to us from Black Journals. So let's get to it and get through it. Praises to the Father.
Hallelujah.
Hallelujah. All right, here we go.
What if I told you that there are a group of Black Indians
that created the largest haven in the U.S. for escaped slaves?
I told you that this is the true story of the Black Seminoles.
They were the strongest alive. They were ready to die to live. You can never find this taught in school because they were so historically unbelievable. Imagine the pain, escaping slavery, the hunger, the thirst, the long trek to safety called the Trail of Tears. The resolved determination for mutual respect, equality, and freedom. And they'd rather die to get there. That's the incredible story of the Black Seminoles. They were warriors of freedom, a cornerstone of a unique culture that historically defied the American predatory foundation for all time. Known as the Black Seminoles or Seminole freedmen, these were a community derived from runaway slaves who eventually integrated into American Indian culture. The Seminoles were unconquered people, descendants of just 300 Indians who had resiliently and very fiercely refused capture by the US in the 19th century. They were mostly Gullah fugitives who escaped from the rice plantations in South Carolina and Georgia, who joined with the newly formed Seminole groups, who also had broken away from the Muskogee or Creek people. Both groups were fleeing the decimation of their cultures and people by European-brought violence and disease, and sought refuge in the Florida forests. Today, more than 2,000 of them live on 6 reservations in the state, located in Hollywood, Big Cypress, Brighton, Immokalee, Eft, Pierce, and Tampa. Seminole history begins with bands of Creek Indians from Georgia and Alabama who migrated to Florida in the 1700s. Conflicts with Europeans and other tribes had caused them to seek out new lands where they could live in peace. Groups of lower Creeks had moved to Florida to get away from the dominance of upper Creeks. Some Creeks were searching for rich new fields to plant corn, beans, and other crops. For a while, Spain even encouraged these migrations to help provide a buffer between Florida and the British colonies. The Seminoles had built their own settlements on the Florida frontier, fought a series of wars to preserve their freedom, and were scattered across North America. They have played a significant role in American history, but never did receive the recognition that was due them. Get ready to dive into a tale of resistance, resilience, and a powerful alliance that rewrites what you thought you knew about American history. Do not forget to like, share, and better still, subscribe to stay with us. This is going to be an interesting ride. Africans have a more than 400-year history in Florida, beginning with the Spanish exploration of the coast and the St. Johns River. The first Africans to reach Seminole County could have been among the early Spanish explorers of the St. Johns River, and certainly were among the escaping plantation slaves of the British colonial years and the later American expansion in the Southeast. Some Gullah slaves, which is what they're also called, managed to escape. From coastal South Carolina and Georgia, south into the Florida Peninsula. In the 18th century, Florida was a vast tropical wilderness covered with jungles and malaria-ridden swamps. The Spanish claimed Florida, but they used it only as a buffer between the British colonies and their own settled territories farther south. They wanted to keep Florida as a dangerous wilderness frontier, so they offered a refuge to escaped slaves and renegade Indians from neighboring South Carolina and Georgia. The Gullahs were establishing their own free settlements in the Florida wilderness by at least the late 1700s. They built separate villages of thatched roof houses surrounded by fields of corn and swamp rice, and they maintained friendly relations with the mixed population of refugee Indians. In time, the two groups came to view themselves as parts of the same loosely organized tribe, in which blacks held important positions of leadership. The Black Gullahs had adopted Indian clothing, while the Indians acquired a taste for rice and appreciation for Gullah music and folklore. But the Gullahs were physically more suited to the tropical climate and possessed an indispensable knowledge of tropical agriculture. And, without their assistance, the Indians would not have been able to cope effectively with the Florida environment. The two groups led an independent life in the wilderness of northern Florida, rearing several generations of children in freedom. And they recognized the American settlers and slave owners as their common enemy. The Americans called the Florida Indians Seminoles, from the Spanish word Cimarron, meaning wild or untamed, and they called the runaway Gullahs Seminole Negroes, or Indian Negroes. Something very interesting was occurring within the interior of Florida throughout the 1700s and early 1800s. Villages of Creek Indian farmers drifted into uninhabited parts of Florida during this period. They had little contact with the Spanish authorities in St. Augustine. The Spanish didn't dare try to evict the Creeks because of their past unpleasant experiences in combating them. The last time the Spanish tried to invade the Creek Nation in 1703, they left behind around 600 bodies lying on the battlefield. The Creeks did not adopt Spanish traditions or religion. These Creeks in Florida eventually became known as Seminoles because they did not have strong political connections with the Creek provinces to the north. However, even as late as 1776, the Seminoles were merely considered a division of the Creek Confederacy, not a separate tribe. This is how botanist William Bartram described his contacts with the Seminoles in 1776. Simultaneously, Africans had continued to escape from plantations in the southern colonies and sought refuge in Florida. It was much easier for the African slaves to escape farms and plantations along the interior frontier because there were virtually no law enforcement officers in these regions. Of course, the Creeks had a long history of sedentary living and well-planned towns, but the Africans had often been treated as little more than livestock by planters. One of the many delusions held by white planters was that Africans were incapable of surviving without the management of white people. Almost immediately after gaining their freedom, the Africans began establishing orderly, clean villages and planting crops in northern Florida. They developed local governments modeled after those of the Creeks. However, the absorption of Native American culture went far beyond politics. The Africans had switched to wearing Creek clothings. They had also learned to speak the Itsate Creek language instead of either English or African. Itsate was the predominant language of South Carolina and Georgia Creeks. What is even more surprising is that the Black Seminoles also adopted the Creeks' ancient monotheistic religion, which was similar to that of the Hebrews before the building of Solomon's Temple, and also the Samaritan sect today. Unlike some other monotheistic religions,
Wait a minute, what did he say?
Seminole women were equal to the men in all ways. In fact, the women owned most of the real estate. However, under the conditions of liberty in Florida,
he said, let me back up, matter of fact. He said they had monotheistic religion similar to the Hebrews. Let me back that up.
The Samaritan sect today, before the also adopted the Creeks' ancient monotheistic religion, which was similar to that of the Hebrews before the building of Solomon's Temple, and also the Samaritan sect today. Hebrews before the Seminoles, South Carolina and Georgia Creeks. What is even more surprising is that the Black Seminoles also adopted the Creek's ancient monotheistic religion, which was similar to that of the Hebrews before the building of Solomon's temple, and also the Samaritan sect today.
Wow. Wow.
I'm not sure what to think of that, Doc. I mean, it is what it is. It's a lot to take in right there.
I mean,
And I wonder, I can't help but to wonder how accurate they are with this. Like if it was in fact the Creek that had that ancient, religion, or was it the Gullah, the Gullah captives that taught them the ancient religion,
Yeah, I mean, it's really no way for us to know where it came from, but I'm thinking. But you know what, though? He did mention the Samaritans.
Oh, well, he was mentioning the Khan. Yeah.
So, that's rather interesting. So we're gonna have to do more research on these Creek people and see what they were talking about. But the Gullahs, I mean, we're starting to find out a little bit about the Gullahs. So that's some interesting stuff, though. That's some interesting stuff. So we definitely have to get some more in depth into this. And man, I want to get this in the hand of Elder Benaiah, and I know he can find some. He probably got some information on it. I don't know, just maybe haven't pulled it out yet.
Yeah, I mean, and he's from Georgia, somewhere. I'm not exactly sure where, but I know that that's where the Gullahs were at, and that's where the Cherokee, or not the Cherokee, but the Creek and the Seminole Indians. That's like Florida and Georgia is where they were at. Parts of South Carolina.
That's interesting. That's interesting. So we'll run that back one more time, and we'll continue from here.
Instead of either English or African, Itzate was the predominant language of South Carolina and Georgia Creeks. What is even more surprising is that the Black Seminoles also adopted the Creek's ancient monotheistic religion, which was similar to that of the Hebrews before the building of Solomon's temple, and also the Samaritan sect today. Unlike some other monotheistic religions, Creek and Black Seminole women were equal to the men in all ways. In fact, the women owned most.
Hold up. Now think about this. This is dawned on me. It says before the time of King Solomon. So that would have been the time of Dawid. That would have been the time of Shaul.
Yeah. And then before that would have been the judges.
Yeah, current. So that was before the kingdom split. So wow. Wow. That's crazy. That's crazy.
And I want to know more about that. Like, are they saying that it was just similar, or are they saying like they had similar names to the Most High? Are they saying that they had a written language? Like, do they keep law, statute, and commandments? Like, you can't just leave me off with that, not telling me exactly. Like,
I know that's a rather bombshell. I've never heard anybody mention the Creeks before.
Well, see, I knew that the Creeks. I thought that the Seminoles became Seminoles when they joined up with the Gullah people. I knew that they were from the Creek just because I had read that before. But different information that we've covered, like here in the last 2 weeks, it kind of differed from that. It kind of, I didn't realize that Seminole was a Spanish name. So, it was almost saying like as if the Seminoles were just the Gullah people, like from different things that we had seen, the last couple of weeks, Yeah,
that's how I took it. And then when he said that, I was like, wait a minute. So Like, okay, kind. But we'll continue, and we'll definitely have to look more and try to find more information about this, because that is rather interesting. So let's continue.
Most of the real estate. However, under the conditions of liberty in Florida, the Black Seminoles flourished. U.S. Army Lieutenant George McCall recorded his impressions of a Black Seminole community in 1826. This, he had said, "We found these Negroes in possession of large fields of the finest land, producing large crops of corn, beans, melons, pumpkins, and other esculent vegetables. I saw, while riding along the borders of the ponds, fine rice growing, and in the village large corn cribs were filled, while the houses were larger and more comfortable than those of the Indians themselves." The remote regions of Seminole County were sanctuaries for many Africans, the allies of the Seminoles during 3 wars and hostilities during the early to mid-1800s. Along the sparsely populated regions of the St. Johns River, blacks became accomplished woodsmen, hunters, and fishermen. Some became prominent leaders as well as guides and interpreters. They used plantation-learned skills to farm and build shelters. The United States, which acquired Florida in 1821, moved army troops and supplies along the St. Johns and other rivers during its campaigns against the Seminoles and their black allies. Many of these people originally had been captured from African fighting tribes. The Seminoles welcomed them as capable warriors and skilled farmers, and allowed them to form their own villages. Many too would be sent to the reservations west of the Mississippi River. From their ranks, the U.S. Army had later on recruited the Buffalo Soldiers of Western law. For the most part, Seminoles and Africans were more like allies against common threats. The U.S. Army, planters, slave hunters, and growing waves of new settlers that led to generational warfare just before slavery split the nation into North versus South. Now let's get down to the basic gist. After the American Revolution, 1776 to 1783, Spain regained control of Florida from Britain as part of the Treaty of Paris. When the British evacuated Florida, Spanish colonists, as well as settlers from the newly formed United States, came pouring in. Many of these new residents were lured by favorable Spanish terms for acquiring property, called land grants. Even Seminoles were encouraged to set up farms, because they provided a buffer between Spanish Florida and the United States. Escaped slaves also entered Florida, trying to reach a place where their U.S. masters had no authority over them. Instead of becoming more Spanish, Florida increasingly became more American. Back when Britain controlled Florida, the British often incited Seminoles against American settlers who were migrating south into Seminole territory. These old conflicts, combined with the safe haven Seminoles provided black slaves, caused the U.S. Army to attack the tribe in the First Seminole War, 1817 to 1818, which took place in Florida and southern Georgia. Forces under General Andrew Jackson invaded Spanish Florida, attacked several key locations, and pushed the Seminoles farther south into Florida. Finally, after several official and unofficial U.S. military expeditions into the territory, Spain formally ceded Florida to the United States in 1821, according to terms of the Adams-Onis Treaty. Damn it. These people were betrayed first by the Spaniards, who never for once cared for the consequences that would befall those whom they've used as buffers for so many years. However, the Seminole settlements in Spanish Florida had kept increasing as more and more runaway slaves and renegade Indians escaped south, and conflict with the Americans had become, sooner or later, inevitable. In 1818, General Andrew Jackson would lead the American army into Florida to claim it for the United States for good. And in doing this, the Seminole War finally erupted. As soon as the United States acquired Florida, it began urging the Indians there to leave their lands and relocate along with other southeastern tribes to Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma. Some Seminole leaders signed a treaty in 1832, and part of the tribe moved. But other Seminoles refused to recognize the treaty and fled into the Florida Everglades. The Black Seminoles and Indians fought side by side as military allies throughout the bloody Seminole Wars, in a desperate struggle to stop the American advance. Andrew Jackson had referred to this First Seminole War as an Indian and Negro War. The thing was, the U.S. government had also planned to rid Florida of Seminoles and capture Africans who had fled American plantations and found sanctuary among the Seminoles in the former Spanish colony. The Seminoles, too, had fled to Spanish Florida after wars and conflicts among rival Creeks of the American Southeast. Andrew Jackson, first as an American general and later as president, pushed a policy of removing all of the tribes to remote land west of the Mississippi River. The Seminoles resisted the drive to push them into western lands occupied by Creeks, whose slaves were treated much the same as those on American plantations. After the passage of the Indian Removal Act in 1830, the U.S. government attempted to relocate Seminoles to Oklahoma, causing yet another war, the Second Seminole War. The Treaty of Payne's Landing, signed by a small number of Seminoles in May 1832, required Indians to give up their Florida lands within 3 years and move west. When the U.S. Army arrived in 1835 to enforce the treaty, the Indians were ready for war. As Major Francis Dade marched from Fort Brooke toward Fort King, 180 Seminole warriors led by Micanopy, Alligator, and Jumper attacked. Only one man of that army detachment survived the ambush. The campaigns of the Second Seminole War were an outstanding demonstration of guerrilla warfare by the Seminoles. The Micos Jumper, Alligator, Micanopy, and Osceola, leading less than 3,000 warriors, were pitted against 4 U.S. generals and more than 30,000 troops. The Second Seminole War, 1835 to 1842, usually referred to as the Seminole War proper, was the fiercest war waged by the U.S. government against American Indians. The United States spent more than $20 million fighting the Seminoles. The war left more than 1,500 soldiers and uncounted American civilians dead. And the obvious duplicity of the U.S. government's tactics marred Indian-white relations throughout the country for future generations. As the hostilities dragged on, frustrated U.S. forces increasingly turned to desperate measures to win the war. For example, Osceola was captured and imprisoned when he met with U.S. troops who had called for a truce and claimed to want to talk peace. With Osceola in prison, the United States was confident the war would end soon, but it did not. Although Osceola died in prison in 1838, other Seminole leaders kept the battle going for a few more years. In 1842, a nominal end to the hostilities arrived, though no peace treaty was ever signed. By this time, most Seminoles had been moved from Florida, relocated to Indian Territory, today's Oklahoma. A third Seminole War broke out in 1855, when conflicts, largely over land, arose between whites and some Seminoles who remained in Florida. Constant military patrols and rewards for the capture of Indians had reduced the Seminole population to roughly about 300 remaining in Florida when the Third Seminole War ended in 1858. These ones hid in the swamps for over a decade. The Black Seminoles waged the fiercest resistance, as they feared that capture or surrender meant death or return to slavery. They hadn't only killed, they had killed twice. The American commander, General Jessup, informed the War Department that this, you may be assured, is a Negro and not an Indian war. And a U.S. congressman of the period commented that these black fighters were contending against the whole military power of the United States. The Black Seminoles had fled the rice plantations, built their own free settlements in the Florida wilderness, and then fought almost continuously for 50 years to preserve their freedom. It is little wonder they should provide some of the finest soldiers in the U.S. cavalry. While studying the then hidden story of Native American slavery, Florida anthropologist John Worth came to the conclusion that at least 600,000 indigenous people in southeastern North America had been abducted into slavery. Slave raiders typically only took with them young women and teenagers. The men, defending their families, were killed by European slave raiders. The native tribe slave raiders usually tortured and killed all men of military age, plus butchered the toddlers, who could not make the walk back to coastal slave markets. Thus, at least 600,000 Native Americans died as a result of slave raids. The big problem with Native American slaves, though, was that unless they were sold to plantations on Caribbean islands, they often found a way to escape back to Indian tribes within the interior. After King Charles II of England became personally involved in the African slave trade, African slaves became preferred by customers in the British colonies. Almost all of the British colonies, including Georgia after 1752 and Canada after 1763, but excluding Pennsylvania, legalized the slavery of Africans. Thus, the lives of African slaves and Native Americans had become interwoven. Books and newspaper articles were even published, then in the Carolinas, which promoted scientific breeding programs for mixing these two races to create ideal slaves. These documents are absolutely repugnant to modern eyes, because they present non-European humans as being no different than cattle or horses. Human slavery had only been a legally sanctioned institution in the North American colonies for 5 years, when the colony of Charlestown was founded in 1670. By 1710, 20% of South Carolina's population was Native American slaves, and 40% was African slaves. During this period, most African slaves had only a minimal knowledge of English. In their isolation on the coastal rice plantations, they had evolved a new language that is called Gullah today. It mixed the words of several African languages with words of the Creek Indians and English. Owners of African slaves, fresh off the ship in New York, Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia, had quickly discovered that many of these people died during the harsh North American winters. Over the eons, they had evolved bodies which thrived in the hot, humid tropical climate of West Africa, but were very vulnerable to cold temperatures. Those that happened to mate with indigenous American slaves produced offsprings, whose more muscular, heavy-boned physiques were much more tolerant to wintertime. The African slaves were only able to orient themselves to this strange new land by listening to the words of the Native American slaves. The indigenous and Mustee slaves told of a land to the south called La Florida, where slavery was now illegal. The boldest slaves found ways to escape their bondage. Some Africans accompanied their indigenous friends to native towns in the interior, but with that came the risk of being captured by English bounty hunters at any time. For slaves to obtain secure freedom meant a dangerous walk in bare feet of over 100 miles to the border of La Florida. Along the way were dangerous swamps filled with several species of poisonous snakes and alligators. Most of these freedom seekers were only dressed in rags and carried little or no food with them. As early as 1687, African slaves fled from the South Carolina Lowcountry to Spanish Florida seeking freedom. Despite Spain's despicable treatment of America's indigenous peoples in the 1500s, human slavery had now been banned. Under an edict from Philip the Fine of Spain in 1693, the black fugitives received liberty in exchange for converting to Catholicism and defending the Spanish settlers at St. Augustine for at least 4 years. However, most of the black militia was more than happy to be permanently allowed to kill English-speaking invaders. After the province of Georgia was colonized immediately north of La Florida in 1788, the Spanish organized the Africans into a militia led by a man named Francisco Menendez. He was a Mandingo from Africa who had escaped a South Carolina plantation in 1724 and rose to the rank of an officer under the flag of Spain. The African militia unit was based at Gracia Real de Santa Teresa de Mose, meaning Royal Thanks of St. Teresa of the town of Moses. It came to be known as Fort Mose. A formally planned settlement was founded around 1738. It was the first legally sanctioned free black town in North America. Contemporary sketches of the fortress suggest that it strongly resembled a fortified Mandingo village, with the addition of Spanish bastions on the corners. In 1740, Fort Mose was attacked by an English army from Georgia under General James Edward Oglethorpe. The occupants fled to Castillo de San Marcos, but the African militia returned in force to attack the English troops there, killing all but about 30 of them. The fort and settlement was rebuilt in 1752, but abandoned in 1763, when Spain and France lost the 7 Years' War, and Great Britain had gained ownership of Florida. However, in the long run down the 1800s, when the army captured the Black Seminoles at some point, the US government had refused to return them to slavery, fearing that these seasoned warriors, accustomed to their freedom, would turn the Seminole War into a widespread slave rebellion. That alliance ended in 1838 when the United States offered to recognize the freedom of the Black Seminoles and pay them money if they would lay down their arms and agree to move to the Indian Territory. Over 500 Black Seminoles took up the offer. Once in the West, many Black Seminoles adapted to the lifestyle of the plains. Most were already expert horsemen. Some became cowboys. Many Black Seminoles accepted an offer from Mexico to form a border patrol to combat Comanche and Apache raiders. In 1850, a group of Black Seminoles and Seminole Indians escaped south across Texas to the desert badlands of northern Mexico. They established a free settlement and, as in Florida, began to attract runaway slaves from across the border. In 1855, a heavily armed band of Texas Rangers rode into Mexico to destroy the Seminole settlement, but the blacks and Indians stopped them and forced them back into the U.S. The Indians soon returned to Oklahoma, but the black Seminoles remained in Mexico, fighting constantly to protect their settlement from the marauding Comanche and Apache Indians. In 1870, after emancipation of the slaves in the United States, the U.S. cavalry in southern Texas invited some of the black Seminoles to return and join the army. Wildcat and John Horse, leaders among separate groups of Seminoles and black Seminoles who were forced to accept reservation land in the Oklahoma Territory, moved to Texas, then across the Rio Grande to live in the mountains of Nacimiento in the Mexican state of Coahuila. The Mexican government, which banned slavery in the years before war between the Union and the Confederacy, allowed the Seminoles and black Seminoles to stay and raise cattle and plant crops in return for providing warriors to patrol the Mexican border with Texas and create a line of defense from raids into Mexico from other tribes. These black Seminoles would be called Mascogos, a name that comes from Muskogee, the language shared by many of the tribes of the Southeast. Mexican Civil War led to the black Seminoles migrating back across the Rio Grande when slavery ended after the Civil War. The moves were encouraged by the U.S. government, which wanted the Seminoles and the black Seminoles to prevent raids into Texas. This was at the end of the Civil War. The black Seminoles had been invited to return to the United States to serve in a special ops unit to combat hostile tribes and enforce martial law in the South during Reconstruction. Those that accepted were promised land and retirement pensions at the end of their service. This had motivated them greatly. They had believed the United States on their word and had taken up the deal, trusting as they can be, for good and survival. The U.S. Army recruited black Seminoles as scouts. This forerunner of the Green Berets or Navy SEALs quickly developed the reputation as the finest military unit in the West. It was soon expanded into being the Seminole Negro Scout Troop of the new 10th Cavalry Regiment. In 1875, 3 of the scouts won the Congressional Medal of Honor, America's highest military decoration, in a single engagement with the Comanche Indians on the Pecos River. However, when it came time for them to retire, although the black Seminoles became known as the best scouts in the best cavalry regiment in the West and won 4 medals of honor, not one of them ever did receive land or a pension thereafter. The U.S. government officials said that it had lost the original treaty and had no record of them serving in the U.S. Army. Like, seriously? Even heirs of the black Seminoles who became the famed Buffalo Soldiers of the Western frontier had to insist that the Army said they would be given their land in return for their military service. But no such documents ever did surface. In 1873, command of the Scouts was given to Lieutenant John Bullis, writes Katarina Vittich in a 2002 research paper. The Mascogos, Native Americans, African Americans, Mexicans. She continues, under Lieutenant Bullis, the Scouts would spend the next 10 years as a major force in the eradication of Indian and bandit depredations in that area of Texas. Every commander who worked with the Scouts praised them for their courage and their skills. And those who worked most closely with them were the most vehement in their protests at the abandonment and mistreatment of the Mascogos by the U.S. government. The Scouts would win 4 medals of honor, an incredible statistic for their tiny numbers. They served valiantly in a number of capacities until they were disbanded in 1914, but the U.S. government kept none of its promises to them. She adds, at the height of the Indian Wars, when the Scouts were continuously in the field providing invaluable service to the U.S. Army and the citizens of Texas, their families and community were starving because the government had cut off their rations and would give them no land or supplies for farming. Instead, some black Seminoles stole cattle to feed their families. Texas cattle ranchers sent hired gunmen to threaten or kill black Seminoles. When John Horse was shot and captured, Wildcat paid his ransom. With little hope of changes, many black Seminoles crossed the Rio Grande again to live in Mexico. The U.S. Army had disbanded the remaining black Scouts empty-handed in 1914. Even Medal of Honor winners? There was neither land nor pensions for any of these loyal-minded black Seminoles. This would mean that they were being tricked all along by the U.S. into their bidding, their crafts, skills and strength exploited yet again, only to be left high and dry in the end. Yet another humiliating betrayal of the blacks this was, by the United States. In 1842,
surprise, they lied again. Well, you
Yeah,
can't even be surprised by that. I mean, this is the norm. You know, for them to lie and say, I'm going to do this for you and do that for you. That's why we demand everything today in writing. Matter of fact, put it on video. Because your track record is terrible.
Right.
Yeah. It's crazy. So let's finish this on out and then we'll get to the next video.
The army forcibly removed them, along with their Indian comrades, to Indian Territory, now Oklahoma, in the unsettled West. The Black Seminoles, exiled from their Florida strongholds, were forced to continue their struggle for freedom on the western frontier. In Oklahoma, the government put them under the authority of the Creek Indians, slave owners who tried to curb their freedom, and white slave traders came at night to kidnap their women and children. However, after all said and done, today, there are still small Black Seminole communities scattered by war across North America and the West Indies. The Black Indians live on Andros Island in the Bahamas, where their ancestors escaped from Florida after the First Seminole War. The Seminole Freedmen, the largest group, live in rural Seminole County, Oklahoma, where they are still official members of the Seminole Indian Nation. The Mascogos dwell in the dusty desert town of Nacimiento in the state of Coahuila in northern Mexico. And finally, the Scouts live in Brackettville, Texas, outside the walls of the old fort where their grandfathers served in the U.S. cavalry. These groups have lost almost all contact with one another, but they have all retained the memory of their ancestors' gallant fight for freedom in the Florida wilderness. In 1978, Dr. Ian Hancock discovered that elders among the Texas Scouts still speak a dialect of Gullah, 140 years after their ancestors were exiled from Florida, and as much as 200 years after their early ancestors escaped from rice plantations in South Carolina and Georgia. Both the Oklahoma and Texas groups, though deeply conscious of their Florida heritage, were unaware of their connection with the Gullah in South Carolina and Georgia. They did not know precisely where their slave ancestors had come from before fleeing into the Florida wilderness. The Oklahoma Seminole freedmen still possess a rich traditional culture combining both African and American Indian elements. They continue to eat rice as a characteristic part of their diet, sometimes applying a sauce of okra or spinach leaves, like the Gullah, and like their distant relatives in West Africa. In closing, it is said that in the year 1970, the Indian Claims Commission had awarded the Seminoles, of both Oklahoma and Florida, collectively, $12,347,500 for the land taken from them by the US military. This brings us to the end of yet another video. Hope you enjoyed it.
Yeah, that should have been more like 12 billion. Boy,
Right.
I mean, that's outlandish. The thought that you would serve and agree to service and be cheated. I mean, but you know, what can you expect? Yeah, that was rather interesting. Definitely want to dig some more into that particular some of those facts that they brought out. But we're gonna go ahead to the. You got anything on that one, Ike?
Well, yeah, Khan, I just pretty much, where is this at in the history books in the schools?
Right.
Most of the information that I learned about the Seminoles was self-study. You know what I mean? It was information that I gathered by actually going to the library as an adult.
Mm-hmm.
This is privy information. I would say very important. They talk about wanting American history being taught, but this is a big part of American history. That is neglected in the school system.
Indeed, no doubt. And man, yeah, they need to definitely tighten that up because, yeah, we should be so privy to this information, and yeah, we should definitely be cognizant, top of mind for us, indeed. But let's continue to the next video. Now, the name of this next video is "Breed for Sale: The Heartbreaking Reality of Breed Farms During Slavery." So this is kind of a different type of video than what we just read. Still informative. This comes from We Still Rise and their YouTube channel. I think this is the first time we've seen them on a review on one of their videos. So let's just get to it. Here we go.
Childbearing for women slaves would start as young as 13 years old. It's more than possible that 4 to 5 pregnancies would have been expected by the time she turned 20. Vulnerabilities faced by enslaved women in a system expecting breeding from them were multiple. It was not beneath this slave market of the 19th century America to sell women slaves during pregnancy. Many would contend that the life of a female slave in America would have been a cycle of rape, pregnancy, and uncared for birth, recovery over a matter of just weeks before pregnancy was expected again. Laws and acts passed across the 18th century in America steadily degraded and destroyed any personhood an enslaved individual had. This process most pointedly took the enslaved from personhood to thinghood, leaving all rights belonging to the owner of the slave and not the person in slavery. As this ideology and culturizing took hold, the sale and purchasing of slaves became accepted, with no objection from American society or its people. There is little altruism to be found in the action of prohibiting slave importation to the United States. The key players in the politics of formative America at the time show us this. President Thomas Jefferson was a renowned slaver, siring 6 children with the woman he owned, Sally Hemings, and Virginia native, well aware of the economic backbone slavery was to the South. Far from the end of importing slaves creating the spark to fire up abolition, the decrease of external slave supplies meant the value of domestic slaves would rise. People had become products along with being the means of production. Virginia, Jefferson's state, would become the leading state in the production of slaves. Over time, the sale of slaves became its leading export product, even above tobacco.
Bro, I know from reading some books like in the South, of course, like that was their leading export or import or their main means of funding was slavery. And this chattel slavery thing, that was a big part of what led to the Civil War. Now, these cats was racist, you know what I'm saying? But at the same time, like without slavery, they had no money. You know what I mean? So I understand why, you know, the Confederates will go ahead and wage war on this, but, you know, just listening to how they treated the women, just breeding them.
At the turn of the 19th century, the transatlantic slave trade was coming to its end. In Britain, William Wilberforce led a movement made up of Quakers and evangelicals to set up the Committee for the Abolition of Slave Trade. Come 1807, the Parliament of Britain passed the Slavery Trade Act, and the turn of the tide in colonial Britain increased calls for the abolition of slavery in America. At this time, the economics of slave labor and its produce was only growing in America. The production of sugarcane, cotton, and rice, particularly in the Deep South and Western America, were lucrative to the point of being viable political capital. Before the American Civil War, King Cotton was a phrase used to summarize the productive monopoly slave states had over abolitionist states in the North. This importance of cotton economically had secession states convinced there would not even be a chance of war with northern states. Yet, in the layered, complicated history of the United States, at a time when slave labor was at its most profitable for America, Congress and President Thomas Jefferson supported calls for abolition. From 1808, importing slaves to America was prohibited as the cotton engine was invented and its production and demand for labor only rose.
So we're talking about America here, but we also got to remember that there were also Africans in Northern Africa and other places that were still being enslaved by Arabs. You know what I'm saying? And the Arab slave trade went on a bit longer, if not a while longer, than the American slave trade when that happened. So it's good to kind of put this in perspective. Is yeah, we're talking about America for me, but at the same time, in different places, you know what I'm saying, it was still going on, and it was lucrative in those areas as well.
Bro, it's still going on. The Arab slave trade still exists. They're still stealing. They're still stealing people and forcing them to work, even lying to people and thinking that they coming to be some kind of job and go to school and whatever the case, and they get them over there and put them straight to slavery. So, let's continue.
The 1808 Prohibition Act served as a great protection to the internal slave market, and slave owners doubled down. Quite chillingly, slave owners referred to breeding as a natural increase, despite the clear management and collective efforts that went into it. In an utter tangle of priorities, black women enslaved in America became a rare pillar, receiving free health care, if not the very first. As termed by Ned and Constance Sublettet in their book The American Slave Coast, the enslaved woman's womb became capitalized. Fertility and its safeguarding became of the utmost importance to those in the slave trade. It's understood that home medical journals began to be circulated to aid slaves through difficult births when the matter would have been previously disregarded. Black female slaves were expected to produce 4 to 5 children. Let there be no mistake, the high mortality rate of slaves was a cornerstone of breeding's importance. Good breeding stock was commonly used to advertise a female slave for sale. Many women in these circumstances would have found themselves being continually bartered and incentivized by slave and plantation owners. It was not uncommon for an enslaved woman to have been posed an offer of freedom should she bear 15 children. The reality,
they treated us like animals, like worse than animals, honestly. It's just sad to know that, people, human beings, our ancestors went through this type of treatment, man, and survived. A lot of them survived, but a lot of them didn't. And that's a sad fact, man. And it's something that I believe that we should be telling our children, and it should be taught in schools, not the watered down version that I was taught when I was in school and shit, but it should be something that we're told the blunt truth of how we were treated, how Americans, Black Americans, were treated.
Was a child as young as 12 to 13 could be forced into pregnancy and give birth to a child that would be taken from her only to be forced into a life of slavery. But people had become products under this system. The means were nothing short of dehumanizing. Childbearing for women slaves would start as young as 13 years old. It's more than possible that 4 to 5 pregnancies would have been expected by the time she turned 20. Vulnerabilities faced by enslaved women in a system expecting breeding from them were multiple. It was not beneath this slave market of the 19th century America to sell women slaves during pregnancy. Many would contend that the life of a female slave in America would have been a cycle of rape, pregnancy, and uncared for birth, recovery over a matter of just weeks before pregnancy was expected again. Masters and slave owners have been detailed in numerous accounts as fathering slaves themselves. With no rights and a legal blockage to any form of personhood, this system forcing children out of women can only constitute rape. Breeding farms held the inequality of white owners being legally protected while their black counterparts had none. Sexual abuse would only be considered one way. Slave
Bro, you know that's happening. The abuse. I mean, it was their property according to the law, right? So they was gonna do whatever they was gonna do. That's crazy. I even heard like there were like the slave masters would even be sexually assaulting their male slaves as well.
Yeah.
I mean,
Perverts.
Accounts.
Yeah. Also, you know, that makes me think about why they say, like the Jewish people, they say that in order to be Jewish, you have to be born of a Jewish woman. That's because these men was out here doing whatever it is they wanted to do, and they didn't want those children to count for anything. But that's the seed. That's literally their seed that they would put into these women and would be born, and they would sell them into slavery. So they selling their own children, their own blood in the children, but because he was born of a so-called Negro, you know, they thought it was nothing. I mean, that's ridiculous. Can you imagine your own seed and treating them like it's nothing?
You can't.
It's crazy. It's crazy. Continuing here. Oh, you got anything on that?
Salakia, La.
Okay, kind. You know, and I know this history has not been, you know, it's known, but it's kind of suppressed. And so think about this: from 12 to 13, then you're expected to be pregnant 4 or 5 times by the time you're 20. And with the promise of 15 children, you could get slavery. You could get freedom. Think our people know about this? You think our people keep this front of their mind when they're out here going on dates and all this other stuff, thinking that they upgrade and get into these situations and these circumstances? You know, we just had a woman not long ago chopped into pieces by a fella on a date. Went back to his place, and now she's not even whole anymore, let alone be seen by her family. So these things, this is beyond disturbing. But let's continue.
Reveal that it was commonplace for slave owners to be intrusive in the sex lives of their property. Arranged marriages and forced mating were part of the breeding culture that started in slavery. With people regarded as chattel, the conditions of their breeding mirrored that of animals. Slave testimony includes the reference to stockmen. Stockmen were male slaves brought to farms to impregnate female slaves of their given owners. This importing of bucks became a theme throughout breeding. Slave owners looked to produce as many slaves capable of the hard physical labor of working fields. There is a famous study by economist Richard Stooch examining the farms of Virginia in 1860. Stunningly, the ratio of female to male slaves was around 2 to 1. The study found in total that the amount of females outnumbering males was as many as 300,000. This would have solely been for the lucrative domestic breeding industry. The inherent racist ideology rooting slavery in America meant slave owners forcing their will on their slaves would have been thought righteous by many. Along with blindness to the systematic rape of the breeding farms, white owners felt their will would have been preferable to that of black slaves. House slaves faced the most danger of being victims of their master's rape. A consequence of this would be many childbearing slaves would shield their children from their master's wife for fear of revealing the father. The account of Harriet Jacobs, a house slave in North Carolina, attested that her master fathered as many as 11 slaves.
Damn. It's crazy, bro.
None of this factory breeding and abuse was for anything other than the reinforcement and strengthening of profit. Accounts include those in the slave trade remarking at the profitability of their breeding farms. A Virginia slave trader declared that the use of enforced breeding policies had brought him 6,000 slave children to sell over a calendar year. Thomas Jefferson is alleged to have boasted that Virginia's capital raised 4% every year through the birth of black children. Once people were considered to be property, the money made from the industry developed and furthered. By the mid-1800s, the South's slave trade has been estimated as worth around $4 billion. This utterly dwarfs the national income in gold and silver, overall currency, and even southern farmland. The slavers had made slaves more valuable than they ever could have thought possible. Most shockingly, the slave trade over the opening decades of the 1800s took slaves from property to securities. The humanist side of taking people's personhood and reducing them to property has long been outlined in the history books. The legal side of turning people into property has been less explored, quite possibly for its stomach-turning consequence. Slave owners of the 1830s wanted more capital in their states and realized a way to do it through the lack of legal status any slave had, by mortgaging them. Banks were set up in informative southern states, including Louisiana and Mississippi, where slaves were mortgaged as properties to the banks.
Damn, son. That was really treating them like property and shit. Mortgaging them? Let me tell you something, man. Like, these people had it hard. You understand? Harder than hard. I mean, and I can understand the frustration with a lot of people. Like nowadays, they still have that deep hatred. Like, and but some of them cats, they be talking about the past as if they lived in that shit. You know what I'm saying? And me personally, I mean, I never lived it. I never experienced it. You know what I'm saying? I'll do my due diligence and find out what happened. And I respect what they went through as far as the struggle. Throughout all this happening, they maintained however they were able to maintain and survive. You know what I'm saying? So that Black people nowadays are still here. And I think it's important that Black people, even everybody, all Americans, but especially Black people, do this type of research and due diligence and find out what their ancestors and stuff went through, because they should not be forgotten. In my personal opinion, they should not be forgotten, man. This struggle continues even nowadays, and it's our responsibility. It's our responsibility to remember it and to continue passing it along. You know what I'm saying?
These mortgages were repackaged.
It's not even just remembering it. I mean, remembering is important, but the reason you remember something is so you can learn from it, so you can do better by it, so that you can grow from it. So it's not enough to understand history, so just so you know it. Just so, oh yeah, by the way, that happened back, at this time, in this month, at this year, this happened. That's not, you got to learn from that. You got to grow from that. You got to be able to make adjustments for that. How do we prevent this from coming back? Because history tends to repeat itself. And now, instead of us being slaves of mortgage, now they still got us mortgage. We still paying rent, mortgages, and just pumping money back into the system. It's a whole different setup now. And you go to work, you work for hours on end, you go home to rest, to come back to work, and your life is an endless cycle of working. You go to work, come home, you if you are fortunate, you get a vacation for a week, and during that week, you run yourself even more ragged so that you can come home and go back to work and continue the cycle. and all it is feeding the system. We just continuously feeding the system, paying mortgages, paying car payments, buying groceries. All of this stuff is just feeding right into the system. And I know we got to do these things to live, and I get that. But how is it different? I mean, it's different, of course, but how is it any different systematically than, them getting paid money for people that they don't? It's the same thing if you got a corporation and you got employees. I got employees that's making me X amount, and you can mortgage that company, that corporation, or that municipality. So regardless of what auxiliary you in, it don't change. So, it's crazy though. This is really crazy, but let's continue. Oh, you got anything on that?
Nah.
Okay.
Into bonds that could be sold globally. This meant many over the world where slavery had been outlawed were profiting from bonds backed by their value. In a sardonic twist, arguably, the prohibition of the slave trade ended up developing the financial roots it formed over an allegedly enlightened world.
I done talked enough about it. However, I did know about the breeding farms and the stockman and all that, but it is just something that we got to keep rehashing. We got to keep, digging, because a lot of these videos, a lot of the books, a lot of the stuff that we kind of research and look at, they don't tell us the whole stories. We have to go to a bunch of different sources to figure out what the hell happened, put everything in context, analyze everything, based on what we see as facts, that we remember what our ancestors went through and that it was not all in vain. I'm saying that today, in the life that we live right now, that we do as much as possible to help realize, the dreams of our ancestors. You know what I'm saying? That we do our best to educate our children, people, whatever, don't matter. But to pass this information along so that everybody else know about it. And some people not gonna want to hear it, bro. Be like, that's the past, that's not happening, woo, woo, woo. That's cool. You're gonna feel how you feel, you say what you say. But it's our responsibility to tell the truth. Not this watered down shit that they be feeding us. You know what I'm saying? But dig, man. It's gonna take some work. Put in the work. Do your due diligence. Get the information. But just don't hold the information. You know what I'm saying? Apply the information. Disseminate the information. It's your responsibility, man. It's all of our responsibility. Knowing that my people went through this is heartbreaking, bro. It's heartbreaking. And we need to do something. We need to educate other people, bro. You know what I'm saying? But yeah, this was a video from Bizarre History. The original link's going to be in the description. Won't you stop by their channel, show them some love?
Yeah, so, man, it's crazy. It's really crazy. A lot of this that people had to endure and deal with and learn. This was a reality that is where we come from. These are the people that said we are descended from. And for them to have to endure these horrible realities, it's atrocious. It's egregious, and it's hard to fathom. It's hard to swallow. But it's just the way that they dealt. Torah says that, and here's the ironic thing. Torah says that you can take a woman who is a captive, and you can make her your wife.
You gotta wait 30 days, right?
Yeah, you gotta give her 30 days. You gotta shave her head and peel her nails. And reason you have to wait that 30 days is, what if she already got some other man's seed in her? What if she already got her husband's seed in her, previous husband, you know, so that way you can see her cycle come, and you know, she got a cycle that she shouldn't be pregnant. But you know, nowadays it's so sketchy because you know women's cycles are so finicky. She might not never have a cycle, and you be thinking she's pregnant, but she might not never produce a child. So it's just crazy. It's a lot of this is some hard stuff, man. This is some hard stuff. Yeah, hard stuff. But I was talking earlier a little bit about, and I'm gonna get to the last video here. It's a rather short video, but I was talking earlier about the you know, living in this society and just continuing to feed the, you know, to feed it. The reality, you know, when we were in our own land, we didn't have these situations. You know, wasn't no mortgages, wasn't no rent. You know, you had your land that you got from your father. You all lived in the same land. What was your father's became yours. What was yours became your children's. And it passed down generation to generation to generation. So that eliminated that aspect of it. There was even times when we were in power, like in the time of Dawid, we had other nations that were subject to us. They paid us tribute. They became tributary to the nation of Israel. And for them to pay tribute meant that our people could subsidize, you know, food. We already had the land, and then whatever other materials we need from the land, we were able to get clothes. We were able to get to live. I mean, we had everything we needed. You know what I'm saying? It was nothing lacked. We had everything. So much that we even gave our power from the land. You know, us working the land, we would bring an offering to the power that gave it to us. And that was everything we needed. So considering this society, and yeah, it's nice to have electricity and air conditioning and, you know, a car to go from here to there, whatever the case. But reality, I mean, do we really need this stuff? Or do we really is this really just a trap that we in, you know, to continue feeding the system? Because I'm really feeling trapped. Really feeling trapped, working constantly just to make money to spend. Do I really need a cell phone that I can, you know, talk to anybody in the country, FaceTime and all this other? Is this stuff really? I mean, consider the cost of it. Is this really what it is? You know, is this really what life is? No, life is so much more than this. So it's crazy to think about. You got anything on that before we get to the next one?
Yeah, just real brief. You know, we actually you know, across the bridge over in Kentucky. You know, that's a slave breeding state. Virginia, one of those slave breeding states. And you know, the history books tell a story of you know, they uplift this society, this culture, but it's just really one that was inhumane. And you know, well, we know what's on its way. And you know, nobody should feel any type of way about it. You know, looking back on the things that have transpired, you know, nobody should be, oh, it wasn't right, or oh, let's pray. You know, like, nah, man.
Yeah, and you know that's the mentality of our people, because we want to, you know, we want to hold hands with everybody and just be happy with, you know, that we're here now. But this is not a vacation. This is captivity, and this is what you gotta be mindful of. This is not. We're not here in this country to be, you know, so-called living it up. That's why we're not living it up. That's why it's hard times. You went from being bred like cattle to now you've just worked constantly. And just because you got on a suit and a tie And some loafers don't mean you ain't being worked like you still working. You still being worked. You know, whether you a nurse, you a doctor, an attorney, work in an office, you know, a banker, whatever it is, they are making money off of you. You are feeding into the system. Every time you get your pay and they say, with my tax money, you are feeding into the system. And I can't remember what scripture said. I think it's Baruch. I think it's Baruch chapter 3. He said, we are subject to payments. This is what we were reduced to from the time of Baruch, the prophet in the OT, who he was a scribe, wasn't he?
Yeah, well, he was a scribe and prophet. Yep.
Okay, yeah. Well, so, was it to Yirmiyahu? Am I remembering that right?
Yeah, indeed, Aki. Indeed.
Okay, yeah. So, you know, Israel, we were subject to payments to these people. These people would hold, you know, we'd have to pay them. There's another place in the text that mentions we are sold our own supplies from our own land. So we have people come into our land and put us to subjugation, and we would have to buy the stuff that the Most High have given us freely. But that was because we went against our power. It's the same reason why we're here. You know, all of this that we see is for that, because we went against our power, and this is the recompense for it. So, all right, we're gonna get to this last video. I'm kind of fired up a little bit. This last video is more about breeding, the horrific reality of slave breeding on plantations. This is aggressive intelligence. This is definitely the first time we've highlighted anything from them. But all the links to these videos are in the description box, and we'll continue to bring out this content. And just, you know, as important as remembering is, the reason you remember something is so you can make an adjustment to it. So I pray our people watch this and make adjustments and, you know, get their mind right. So let's go ahead and get to it.
America banned the importation of slaves from the West Indies and Africa in 1808. This had hardly any effect on actual slavery in America. Although there was still a small amount of smuggling, the majority of new slaves in America were the result of what plantation owners referred to as natural increase. The South produced people in addition to the commercially viable commodities of cotton, rice, sugar, tobacco, and other grains. You would understandably wonder, why ban slave imports but not slavery itself? The rationale is that economics, not humanitarian consideration, was the driving force behind the ban of many of its supporters, including Thomas Jefferson. The South produced and sold enough slaves domestically that the addition of foreign slaves lowered prices and reduced earnings. Slave production was not a natural process. It required systematic administration. The birth of black offspring, President Thomas Jefferson bragged to George Washington, was growing Virginia capital stock by 4% yearly. This is a look inside America's nasty little secret, slave breeding farms. So sit back, relax, let's get into it. According to the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, 12.5 million Africans were transported to the New World between 1525 and 1866 during the entirety of the New World slave trade. 10.7 million people disembarked in North America, the Caribbean, and South America after surviving the feared Middle Passage. And how many of these 10.7 million Africans were shipped straight to the United States? Exactly 388,000. Yes, a very small fraction. In actuality, the vast majority of African slaves were sent straight to the Caribbean and South America. Brazil alone got 4.8 million Africans. The overall number of Africans who came to the United States during the slave trade is thought to have been around 450,000. Some academics believe that an additional 60,000 to 70,000 Africans arrived in the United States after initially landing in the Caribbean. Amazingly, the majority of the 42 million African Americans are descendants from this little population of less than 500,000 Africans. That is an alarming statistic. How is that possible, you ask? Answer: slave breeding. According to the majority of sources, the American slave breeding industry operated as follows. Slaves were the primary domestic crop in certain states, most notably Virginia. The production of rice and sugar in neighboring states, as well as ongoing territorial development, were two industries that anchored the price of slaves. Breeders could essentially depend on future demand and rising prices as long as the slave population grew. Due to this, slaves were no longer merely a commodity, but also the closest thing white farmers had to money. Although it's difficult to put a number on how valuable individuals were as commodities, according to reasonable estimate, the worth of all American slaves in 1860 was estimated to be around $4 billion, greatly surpassing the value of all the gold and silver that was then in circulation in the country, $228 million. All of the North's entire money supply of $435 million, and even the value of all the cropland in the South, valued at $1.9 billion. For slavers, the value of slaves exceeded all other assets combined. The number of slaves in the United States was constrained after 1808 due to the ban of their importation. This happened at a time when short staple cotton production in the uplands was expanding. Because of the development of the cotton gin, clearing land for cotton cultivation spread all over much of Deep South, notably the Black Belt. The local labor market experienced a rapid increase in demand, which fueled the growth of the domestic slave trade. At the same time, the Upper South had an abundance of slaves due to the change from tobacco farming to mixed crop cultivation, which required less work. Slave owners in the Lower South pressured the women slaves to have a lot of children in order to increase the supply of slaves. They considered the fertility of a slave woman to be a measure of her productivity. The terms breeders, breeding slaves, childbearing women, breeding period, and too old to breed were popular during this time. In order to generate additional slaves, slave owners frequently bred their slaves. These breeding operations served to fill the demands of the South by producing many slaves as possible for sale and distribution. The eastern shore of Maryland and Richmond, Virginia, had two of the biggest breeding farms. Slave merchants like Franklin and Armfield, the largest slave trading company in the United States, which was founded in 1828 by Isaac Franklin and John Armfield, were frequently used by planters in the upper southern states to sell slaves to the Deep South. Franklin and Armfield sold more enslaved people, separated more families, and made more money from the trade than almost anyone else in the United States. They were two of the wealthiest men in the country, having acquired fortunes worth billions of dollars in today's money. Franklin and Armfield operated slave selling businesses out of Natchez, Mississippi, with other locations in Vidalia, Georgia, St. Francisville, Louisiana, and New Orleans. The supply of slaves was handled by Armfield's nephew, who sent agents door to door throughout Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware in search of slaves whose owners would be interested in selling them, and he would set up transportation. Louisville, Kentucky, located on the Ohio River, served as a significant slave market and port for the transportation of slaves to the South through the Ohio River and the Mississippi River. By 1840, New Orleans was the fourth biggest city in the United States, and the richest, largely as a result of its slave trade and related industries. It also possessed the largest slave market in the nation. Due to its location as a port, Richmond sent between 10,000 and 20,000 slaves to states further in the South and West each month. The main domestic crop in Virginia was slavery, not tobacco. You may have seen images of slaves being unloaded at New Orleans, but it's more probable that they originated in Richmond rather than Africa. The Fugitive Slave Act ensured that if a slave escaped, they would be returned with the help of the federal government. The majority of slaves on the breeding farms were women and children who were too young to be sold, together with a small number of males whose duty there was to impregnate as many slave women as they could. To prevent the slaves from knowing with whom they were having forced intercourse, hoods or sacks were sometimes placed over their heads. It may be a friend, relative, sister, niece, aunt, or their own mother. The only thing the breeders wanted was the kid they could sell. Many runaway slaves chronicled their experiences in publications known as slave narratives during the antebellum era. Many people recall that slave masters routinely meddled in their slaves' sexual life, primarily the women. The slave narratives also attested to the violence that slave women suffered at the hands of their masters, their sons, or overseers, including forced sex, forced matings, arranged marriages, and other sexual assaults. It's a terrible fact that owners force their female slaves to have children. They are frequently paired with powerful, large males to generate effective slave workers. The market price is higher for bigger children. Other offspring were born as a consequence of white owners or their friends and relatives sexually assaulting female slaves. Lighter-skinned slaves who could work as domestic helpers and occasionally as fancies, which is a nicer term for prostitutes, had their own market. In addition to being about power and pleasure, sexually assaulting black women was also seen by the slave master as a smart business move. White culture held the view that black women were inherently lusty people for the whole time that slavery existed in America. The notion of the African woman as hypersexual made her the subject of both white men's hatred and his fantasy, since the ideal white woman was seen as pure and in the 19th century, modest to the point of prudishness. In the confines of slavery, masters frequently believed it was their right to have sex with African women. Female slaves might occasionally consent to advances in hopes that they or their offspring would eventually be freed by the master. Most of the time, however, slave owners took slaves by force. They did, however, occasionally force sex on married slave women. A key component of the connection between enslaved men and women is highlighted by the slave husband's helplessness to shield his wife from such violations. The black man's capacity for authority over his wife was diminished by the master's power over both of them. Slaves who were wed or whose union was not recognized had no joint property. Additionally, due to sex-based labor segregation and the frequent sale of male slaves, women were not only left to raise their children alone, but also had to place greater importance on female friends and family members than on their own husbands. Despite the fact that historians debate on the extent to which forced reproduction was institutionalized, it is obvious from oral history accounts and other personal reports that enslavers did participate in the practice. In Virginia, James Green, a slave, said that his master picks the wife for every man on the plantation. No one had any influence on the woman he was about to marry. With master's finger pointing out whose wife was whose, that was the whole of our wedding ceremony. A slave defendant named Will Ann Rogers said that her mother, a former slave in Virginia, had informed her that her master made his slaves like livestock. Sam Everett, a slave in Virginia, stated that if there seemed to be any slight reluctance on the part of either of the unfortunate ones picked to be together, Big Jim would make them consummate this relationship in his presence. In addition to the financial gain, he noted that enslavers experienced sadistic pleasure from this. He enjoyed these orgies very much and often entertained his friends in this manner. Quite often, he and his guests would engage in these debaucheries, choosing for themselves the prettiest of the young slave women. According to an examination of the 1850 U.S. Census, of all the southern states, Virginia had the most mixed-race slaves, numbering 44,299. This is a little over 10% of the total slave population. It's possible that many slave owners were happy to let their slaves make their own mating selections, but even then, pressure was still in use. When an enslaved adolescent girl reached maturity, she would have known that choosing a spouse of her own choice was preferable to having the decision made for her. And women who were unable to bear children were greatly despised and frequently sold away from their families. Slaves were urged to become pregnant by their captors in both subtle and not so subtle ways. Many offered additional rations and lighter workloads to women who were pregnant or nursing. Some were known to give enslaved women little gifts when they had a child. A Virginia slave owner named B. Talbot promised an enslaved woman named Jenny in 1792 that if she bore him 5 children, he would free her and her 6th kid, which he did in 1803. In the 18th and 19th centuries, slavery and its growth played a crucial role in the development and modernization of America, propelling the U.S. into modern, industrial, and a capitalist economy. The South expanded from a small coastal strip of dilapidated tobacco farms to a subcontinental cotton empire in the course of one lifetime. It produced 2 billion pounds of cotton a year and had 5 times as many slaves as it did during the American Revolution in 1861. The United States gained a near monopoly on the production of cotton, a critical raw material for the Industrial Revolution, and developed into a worldwide power rivaled only by England, thanks to slavery and slavery alone.
Hey, you watched to the very end. We appreciate it, guys. Thanks for watching.
Man, that was great journalism, but man, a horrendous topic. And
Kind of,
yeah.
you know, it's kind of hard to put it into words like how I'm feeling right now. You know, I feel like it's, you know, our ancestors that went off, you know, we've read about it, and you know, we have trouble reading about it. It's hard to read and hear about. But the scripture says that we will wax worse, right? And we wonder, like, how do these things happen? Like, how do we become worse? And then we hear about, you know, the stories that we've heard about tonight, how we were bred like cattle. We've heard about inhumane practices that, you know, ruled over us, you know, so it shouldn't be any surprise like why the level of pettiness and the level of wickedness that we see amongst our people. You know what I mean? Like, it's almost like we've been bred for it, you know? And I almost feel guilty because, you know, it was in the vast majority of my life, I've spent, you know, chasing this American dream and trying to be a part of all of this. You know, it was, you know, just when I came into this walk, it's like when I started learning the truth and learning more. Like, I understood that our people were in slavery here in this country, but
what that means.
yeah, kind of. I just I feel guilty about wanting to be a part of this, and I feel guilty for not doing something proactive about it. You know what I mean? And this was 100 years ago. 200 years ago.
Right. Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, to think about, to kind of go into that, we've learned about the Seminoles and the Creeks and the gully people in that first video, and then these last two videos are like, wow, just jarring, with this information. And it definitely makes you examine yourself, because this is the reality. This is the reality that we come from. He posed a question: 600,000 slaves. Now we, 44 million people. How'd you do that? Like, man, that's crazy. That is literally crazy. Like, they were literally, and here's the even more ironic thing. Yeah, they was breeding us, and yeah, we had to, they expected production of us, but we had that same thing in the scripts. Gideon, the brother Gideon, 70 sons?
Yeah,
didn't even talk about his daughters. 70 sons. I mean, and then they all got murdered, by his son he had, by the child he had, by the concubine. He killed all his sons, all his brothers. And yeah, we got to learn from this stuff. We got to do better ourselves and stop letting, being misled. And man, it's hard. It's real hard. This is a lot of difficulty. You know what I'm saying? It's really no easy way to swallow this thing. And so that's really all I got. I'm gonna leave it there, because this is a hard topic to think about. This is where we come from, and my people not from Virginia. A lot of our people, my mother's people came from South Carolina. I don't know where exactly my father's people came from, but how long they've been in Arkansas. But man, that is something else to think about. Just being bred like cattle. You have 5, I'll give you. I'll let you go with the last one. And she just, it's crazy. It's crazy. So we'll go ahead and close out there. There's not much else we can say about this situation other than it's horrendous. We're gonna close out with the book of Ecclesiastes. This book, this understanding this will help keep us out of these situations. Let us hear the conclusion. This is the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter number 12 and verse number 13. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear the Most High and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. It's so very important that we understand that in the conclusion of the whole matter, we are to fear the Most High and keep his commandments, because this is the whole duty of man. At the end of the day, when it is all said and done, all the dust is settled and all the smoke is cleared, we will be judged on whether we have feared the Most High and kept his commandments. Why? Because this is the entire reason that we were made. I am your Akasaki Yahoo, joined by my most esteemed Akinanaya, giving all praises, honor, and great esteem unto the Most High Power, Yahuwah Bahashem, Yahushua HaMashiach, and to the 12 tribes of Israel who are scattered to the 4 quarters of the earth. I say Shalom Wabarukim, that is peace and blessings. And I cannot wait to the day that the Most High brings us back together when we are once again 12 tribes, one family, one nation, under the Most High power, under one covenant, and back in our own land with a heart of flesh and not a heart of stone. Until that day, shalom, family.
Shalom, shalom, Mr. Pakai.
All praises to